I noticed at the end of roll call, that the room was muted. I apologize. So I'm just gonna note who we have present for the recording, since we do have, we have our DWR representative who's joining us online. But also for those who may be watching the recording in the future, I just want to note, we have directors Cassidy, Engfer, Koenig, Largay, Lang, Leishman, Martinez, Perry, and Pollock. So, thank you.
Okay, and not hearing any oral communications from anyone, am I correct about that?
Correct.
Okay, with consent agenda, can I get a motion?
Moved. Second.
Okay, all the, so we have roll call vote because one of our directors is virtual, yes, roll call vote.
Director Cassidy,
Yes.
Engfer,
Abstain.
Koenig,
Aye.
Largay. Aye. Lang,
Yes.
Leishman,
Aye.
Martinez.
Aye.
Perry,
Aye.
Pollock,
Abstain.
and that's it.
Okay, thank you. Second is the groundwater sustainability program update. Yeah, sure, that's Ron.
That is Rob. I'm gonna share my screen again, and, okay, Rob. It should, maybe there's just a lag there. Let's see if that. Not sure why that's not. Go ahead, Rob, and let me fix that other one. It is sharing online because I can see it here.
That's
So-
because I kicked out the plug, I think.
Did you?
Yes, I did. Right into it, bent the thing.
I will stand, I will like to stand.
Yeah.
So, spring has sprung, for those of you that can see the presentation. And I put together, I think, 3 different sets of data here. One is gonna be on groundwater extraction over long term. We're gonna talk a little bit about the spring water levels in the ground and in the streets as well. So, first of all, I think I showed this data to you previously, but essentially, we're now 40 years worth of data that we have collected. So when we had to comply with the law and develop the groundwater sustainability plan, we were able to get fairly reliable data back to 1985. So as we get through the water year 2024, we now have 4 decades worth of data. And I thought it was very interesting to kind of just plot this up. So you can see year to year variability, but you can also, I put the decadal average, and it really is interesting to see both in this basin and the Mid-County Basin, the history. In the first 10 years through 1994, we're extracting an average of just under 3,900 acre feet per year. Then we have these peak years from 95 to 2004, about 4,400 acre feet per year. We have that tremendous growth. But starting in 2005 through 2014, the average has come down to 3,600. And in the last decade, so since Sigma passed, our average extraction is 2,700. So between those 2 decades, phenomenal 25% reduction in groundwater extraction. From the latest decade to that peak decade, 40% reduction. So really impressive. And really, when you look at this, you have the 19 and 20, 21. A lot of this is related to the impacts of the CZU fire, where it didn't have access to surface water, so we're pumping additional groundwater. So that number would likely be lower for those conditions. So again, really good results that we're seeing. So this water year, how do things look? Not so great. This is the average precipitation that we're measuring at Boulder Creek, San Lorenzo Valley Water District. Typically get about 50 inches of water around this time of year, and we're currently at about 32. So not the worst, but certainly we've been trending down for the last 3 years. So in response to that, let's take a look at some of our groundwater levels. I've always stressed to you, I think spring is the most important time to be looking at groundwater levels because you're coming out of the wet period. You're gonna see the best conditions that you should in the basin, and that represents, okay, now as our demands start to increase, what are we looking at, right? Where are we starting this year at? So when we look at groundwater levels, we have 2 different systems, a shallow Santa Margarita sandstone. And this is gonna be, we're gonna show you some graphs from these, but essentially the sandstone itself is pretty limited to this area. Anywhere outside of there, we don't have Santa Margarita sandstone. It's uplifted, eroded off. The deeper wells north of Bean Creek, called that green, that's Monterey Formation, really not good aquifer, right? So Santa Rosa Valley Water District produces from the Santa Margarita in these locations. You're gonna have some domestic uses up there, but it's really not a very high yielding aquifer. South of Bean Creek in the Mount Hermon Scotts Valley area is where we have the Lompico and the Utano sandstones, which is where we draw the majority of our water. So again, we're gonna look at the shallow zones, the Santa Margarita, and then we'll look at some of the deeper aquifers.
Rob, I'm gonna stop this sharing and try to reshare this. For some reason, that's not getting picked up, so. It's because we've got some folks online, so I wanna make sure that they're able to see it, so it looks like it's working. Great.
Okay. So looking at the shallow. So we're gonna look at 4 different hydrographs around the basin. And what I want to point out to you before we start is on each of these, we have a green line. That's the measurable objective. This is something you have to define in Sigma. We call it the aspirational goal, right? This is where do we want to be someday. Then in red, we have the minimum threshold, and there's a red for a reason, sort of your stop sign. You don't want to go below that. If you do, you're experiencing undesirable results. So we have each of these hydrographs plotted up compared to their respective measurable objectives, minimum thresholds. And then what we do is through the long term, I always like to point out in red the spring level again, because I think it's one of the most important. So it gives us a good indicator. We can kind of compare year to year. It also tells us where we're starting off in this particular year. So we can see in Quail Hollow, water levels actually from 23. So this red dot compared to, 24 compared to 25, essentially static. So very stable out there. Down in the Pasatiempo area, we have a slight decline. It's about 3 feet or so. This is to be expected, given again, how really disappointing of a winter we had. In the Olympia area, we have again, fairly consistent water levels, just slightly lower than the previous year. And in the Scotts Valley area, again, a few feet, but again, nothing alarming considering what we saw, not getting a lot of recharge. So that's where we're starting the water year in the shallow aquifers, the Santa Margarita sandstone. And then looking at some of the deeper aquifers, so Scotts Valley monitoring well, TW19, completed in the Lompico aquifer, we're actually continuing to see some nice increases. So that's sort of to be expected after the really wet 2023, 2024, Lompico's a little bit deeper. Takes a little bit longer for that recharge to happen, but that's really good news to see the latest spring level up a few feet from the prior. Again, in the Pasatiempo area, now looking at the deeper area, they're fairly static. In the Cannon Well, which is in the Butano aquifer, the deepest, water levels have really just been pretty static throughout. And in fact, we think that this third dot, that we have this large blip, that may not have been a very good data point, but we don't have enough information to exclude it. But essentially, we're looking at fairly static conditions out there. And again, the deepest aquifer, we're not really seeing much happening out there. It's something we're gonna wanna look at as we start to conduct our periodic evaluation. We have these measurable objectives you can see significantly higher. And if nothing's been happening out in that, is that an appropriate measurable objective? Can we actually hope to achieve that? Since we don't really operationally have a lot planned for that area. So we're gonna look at that a little bit closer. But we're well above the minimum threshold, which again, is really how you get judged by the state. The state, the success in Sigma is the absence of undesirable results. So we'd love to get to the measurable objectives. That's that extra layer of protection that we have for long term, but it's really avoiding the undesirable results. And lastly, Scotts Valley Water District had a production well in the Monterey Formation. Again, not a very high yielding well. They stopped using that, David, several years ago.
Yeah.
There's really not much other use that's happening out in this area around Scotts Valley, and you can see it's just slowly recovering. And again, it's just an example of just really, it's not a really good aquifer. So even though there's no use, it's recovering, it's great, it's above the measurable objectives. We wouldn't project that anything's gonna happen there, but that's just what it is, So we just started the dry season monitoring. So again, the rain has stopped. Now we're looking at our creeks. We know that they're fed by the groundwater system. So this hasn't rained in a good month. We know that all the flow that we're observing and the flow that we're going to observe for the next 6 months or so is really related to discharge from groundwater. And so we pay attention to this. what we started doing since we established these stations back in 2021, we have each of these now 5 years plotted up so we can see, and again, it's all expected considering the precipitation that we had in the previous year. So 2023 was phenomenal. We saw tremendous flows in our early May measurements. And 2024 was drier, but we again had so much recharge in 2023 that we continue to see additional discharge into the creeks associated with that. And finally, as we're starting the new year, we can see that we're stepping down. These numbers are still much better than what we were experiencing back in 2021, 22, but they're really declining almost half of what we were experiencing back in 2023. What I'll point out here is that you can see that all of these stations, with the exception of Mill Creek, are very consistent, right? So we know that really San Lorenzo River at Big Trees is a good indicator for what we're experiencing in the basin as a whole. It's the point that's collecting all of the discharge from those creeks. So we really, as we look at our periodic evaluation, we can start to say, do we need all of these locations that we're doing this dry season long-term on, or can this serve as a substitute in combination with our monitoring wells that we have? So we'll be evaluating that as we start to do the periodic evaluation of our plan. Finally, Newell Creek, just briefly, it's the only regulated creek because we have Loch Lomond. And the 5.45 that we saw last year was really related to releases associated with some maintenance activities out there. It's generally very consistent in the 2 cubic feet per second range. Yeah. So that's the hydrology, the precipitation, groundwater levels. I wanted to report that we have had some good discussions related to signal compliance. We, as a group, I was volunteered, thank you, Sierra. Sierra couldn't attend. So a coalition, so a representative from the Ojai Basin, from Sonoma Basin, myself, and a couple of our lobbyists that got us access to a number of meetings with our local legislators to essentially plead our case about how the cost of signal compliance for a tiny basin like this is really outsized compared to some of these large basins. So we met with them and talked about the cost of compliance, and we're looking for ways to reduce those. We are working with the Department of Water Resources, but we also stressed to them that we really would like to see some funding come through as well. Right, so for us to comply with SGMA, we are a sustainable basin by all indicators. It's simply the cost of complying with the reporting and the monitoring is kind of crushing for a basin this size. So we did request that they consider making some directions out of Prop 4 that would go to smaller grants for smaller basins to help them with compliance costs. We did meet directly with Assemblymember Pellerin, staff Senator Laird, water policy consultant Speaker Rivas, chief consultant to Assembly Parks and Water, and water consultant to Senate Natural Resources. So we really met with some very important people. The intent was really just to get on their radar right now. We know the budget situation is really not very positive. So we know it's sort of a long game, but we thought we had success. We actually had 10 meetings. It was kind of a whirlwind day on May 7th. And on May 8th, we had the second of a series of meetings that we're having with the Department of Water Resources Sustainable Groundwater Management Office to work with them to explore ways to actually reduce some of our costs. So again, what we've been trying to do with them, and we think we really have some traction, and we're not the only ones that have been pleading this. So it's not like we're there and, you know, there's a lot of it's a momentum building around looking for ways to cut costs simply for complying. And in one of the examples that we're looking at reducing long-term costs would be in the annual reporting. So just as an example up top is a hydrograph that we have to prepare every year. Use our consultant. We download this data. We have to show that based on the regulations, what the water year type was compared to the measurable objectives, et cetera. Well, at the same time, we actually upload the raw data to the State Department of Water Resources, and it generates hydrographs of the same information. Might not be as pretty as the one that we create, but this is largely sufficient, right? The only thing that this hydrograph doesn't have is it doesn't show the water year types. And so part of what we've been exploring with them is that really gonna be you passing or failing us on an annual report submittal? And so they're really willing to work with us to pilot this out this year on ways to comply with the annual report that may not explicitly meet the letter that's in there, but meet the intent. And so again, what they've created here is you can actually download a custom report for the water year and it will generate all of the hydrographs for all the data that you submitted. So we're gonna be exploring just taking this and inserting this in the appendix rather than the additional step of having new hydrographs created for every one of these, right? There's nothing I'm doing with this data on this particular hydrograph that I can't get from data at the Department of Water Resources. So we're hoping to save some expenses there. Another one that we've had some headway with, and Chris, you're familiar with this, Director Perry, sorry, the contour maps that we create, right? We have 4 aquifer systems that we have to create. We have to do a spring and a fall. It's a lot of effort to create those contour maps. And there's really very little value in our area. And so we've explored with them ways to express the data in a tabular format to be able to discuss it. And again, they're open to doing a pilot with us over the next several months, say, well, this would suffice because it's really getting us the information. And I would argue it's in a more useful form than simply creating those contour maps. So again, we're looking for some areas we think we're gonna get some headway there. And they've committed to meeting with us long term. So we'll continue to explore ways to reduce those costs. That's it. Yep. That is my report. There are questions.
Do we have any questions from the board?
Just a
Yeah.
comment, Rob, Sierra, thank you. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for taking the time to do that. I think it's super important that we try to get, these costs down, because they just seem to be escalating, continuing to go up and up and up. And so everything I think we can do is to try to convince them, that we can do, we can meet the objective, and maybe not do as much, so. Appreciate, you named a bunch of small water systems, are there other small agencies? It seems like it'd be important to get as many of those small agencies.
We're doing that.
Band together, right, and a large number, so that can present to them like, hey, there's a lot of, agencies out here that can really struggle, to try to make this work.
Yeah, we currently have about a dozen in the coalition. There are a little over 24 basins that extract less than 10,000 acre feet statewide. So we are reaching out to those additional ones. And the value is that the ones that we have brought to the coalition, again, if you saw the list of some of the legislators and the positions, they're some pretty influential areas. So we're hoping that this effort will sort of lead to sort of an outsized benefit, right, compared to just the sheer number of us.
Right.
Excellent report, really fascinating. Ditto on the cost containment effort. That's terrific. I had a couple of questions, one question about a couple of the charts. Where in most instances, we are exceeding measurable objectives already. And a couple we're close, but not quite. Is there any benefit to the resource, whether surface water or groundwater, of achieving the measurable objective? Would that, or is that mostly about having a margin of safety or showing a trend towards sustainability?
Well, again, the Santa Margarita, it doesn't really store water very well, right? It kind of comes and goes on an annual basis. So not as much there. Obviously you want to meet those, right? That is going to provide both, but to allow you to move into the extended drought periods, right? And still stay above minimum thresholds. And also potentially, again, future demands that may be in the region, right? That's why we want to meet those. In those deeper aquifers, there's greater value because of the length of time that it takes to recharge them and the fact that they don't tend to discharge out to the creek systems, right? So meeting that is a really good part of your reservoir. That's again gonna help you in those extended dry periods and potentially any future development demands.
Sure, thank you.
Anybody else? I would just say, I think, sorry.
It's okay. Hi everybody, I'm Monica, new District 5 Supervisor, first time from here. Going back to the advocacy that you were doing, for somebody who's trying to get caught up, do you have like a kind of a policy paper, policy platform of the type of legislation that would help alleviate the costs, or it's something you could send me so I could get caught up and use my own sort of relationships, whether through CSAC or through other spaces to advocate? Is there something
We
that?
don't have something specifically, but that's starting to emerge based on the conversations that we had with some of the legislators. So there's some specifics in terms of the funding requests, those are almost more straightforward. As opposed to, there's a point at which, and we think it's more in a couple of years. So essentially, most of the basins in the state will be starting what they call a periodic evaluation. It's every 5 years it's required. And this is the first one, right? And so the state is waiting to see what the results of that look like before they want to make any significant changes to the regulation. And then there's also the legislation. And that's where we understand that there's always hesitance to open up, right? If you start to write some simple little change that we're suggesting, that somebody else wants to get in and pile on it. So I think that that information, we're going to be developing it over the next year or two in a more official type of policy. But
I appreciate that.
Is there anyone else? Anything from the public? Or vast audience or new guests?
Not seeing any hands up online.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Good job. Okay, we have appointment of well owner alternate representative. We recommend we ratify the appointment of Francis Chi, known as Frank Chi for me, as well owner representative alternate on the Santa Margarita Groundwater Board of Directors for a 3-year term, effective immediately. Do I have a motion?
Move.
Second. Okay. Roll call.
Catching up. That was quick. Here we go, Director Cassidy,
Yes on Frank.
Director Amber,
aye.
Tony,
Aye.
Larga,
Yes.
Lang,
Aye.
Leishman,
Aye.
Martinez,
Aye.
Harry,
Aye.
Pollock.
Aye.
Okay. It's unanimous, and then, yeah.
Congratulations, Frank. I think you're on.
Thank you.
You gotta join us.
I get to sit at the big kid
Well,
table.
because. I see your name.
We
Whose
confirmed it,
name are you?
legal
I knew about the
counsel.
self-selection process in the private world.
Oh, wow, the names are printed out. It seems premature.
That was a big risk, though.
Well, maybe while we're on this agenda, I'll just say that I've had the pleasure of serving with Frank on the county commission for water. For 6 years or so. I think you were on it when I started in 2018. And it's just a wonderful collaboration. I always value your input, and it will be wonderful to have your input in this forum.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that. And I will say, it'll be sad when you're not actually sitting at the board, that you have to sit there quietly. And you can't share.
It's
That's
always a
okay.
risk being an alternate because you're essentially gagged,
Yeah.
but I think I can pay members of the public to come in and speak on my behalf. There's no
No, you
technical
can say
solution in that, right? Well, hi, Terry. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been, I've sat in and out of these meetings for, maybe 4 years. Started during COVID, and a quick story, it was all Zoom back then. I would go through all the different directors on the call and look at email. I started emailing all these folks saying, hey, I'm a private well owner, can we talk? And I was shocked by how many people came back and gave me 30, 45 minutes on the phone to educate me sort of on water. Really appreciate that. So the other thing I found very refreshing is that my view of local politics was not very high, based on potholes in school districts and things like that, but water has been very refreshing. It's sort of not intended to be humorous. and that it's issue options solutions. It's very businesslike and I really respect that. So thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Okay. Let's move on to 4.2.
No, we have a.
Oh, go ahead. Yes, sure,
So,
please.
My name's Erica Snows. I'm here mostly to introduce myself. I served with Doug on the WASAC, the Water Supply Advisory Committee for the city of Santa Cruz several years back. I'm sure you guys all have heard of that. And anyway, I just wanted to introduce myself because I am now a well owner in the area. I wasn't previously. I didn't want to be gagged, so so we talked about that a little bit. I said, go for it, Frank, so that way I can speak it also. Yeah, so I just want to come tonight, introduce myself, say hi, and hopefully we'll continue our conversations as time goes. Thank you all for your time and service. I'll let you guys do the budget talk. I know it's gonna be really exciting. So have a wonderful meeting. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you came down. You were very well qualified. It was a good splitting of the.
Right, no, it's fine. Why be contentious when, we can talk. It makes more sense, so.
Right.
Yeah, have a wonderful day.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Okay, proposed budget fiscal year 2026.
I have that one. I'm gonna share my screen and pull up the budget table here and we can go through that together. I will say that the budget that you're gonna see tonight, is very similar in many regards to the budget that, you saw at our last meeting in February, the preliminary budget. With a couple notable changes here. So let me get this up so the folks online can see as well and make this larger so I can see it. Start at this scale and then I can make it larger. It's also in the packet for those of you who are looking at this in the packet. I'm gonna blow this up in just a minute, but let me start with just by orienting people to the setup. Same as the February version that we looked at here, the leftmost column, leftmost column is the description, but once we get into that first column with the black header there are the 2024 fiscal year 2024 actuals. Then we have the budget that was approved by the board last year for our current fiscal year. We have our revised and projected budget. This is where there have been some changes. There were changes. There was a revised budget that the board was briefed on at the February meeting, and then a subsequent change here that I'm going to talk about. Then we have the proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year and a comparison between the approved budget from last year and the proposed budget from the current year. So in terms of the beginning reserves, there is not a change in the bottom line from what you saw in February. However, there is a change in the allocations there. And so when we're looking at the revised and projected, and specifically the 5-year GSP evaluation, that second amount, that has increased. So this is the second time this has increased at the outset of the year. We estimated the GSP cost at 100, or the reserve for the GSP, that is the set aside that we anticipate being used at 125,000. We did not think that was going to be the total cost. However, that was the amount of reserve that we could set aside at the time while still hitting our general reserves target. As a reminder, the board established a general reserve target of 15% of annual operating expenses. And so the change was when we came back in the February budget, that estimate had gone up to 175,000, and that was based upon work that was happening in the Mid-County on their periodic evaluation. As we've mentioned a few times, they're a couple of years ahead of this basin, and so looking at the cost to complete that and the anticipated work here, that budget was increased. In considering that it's likely that Santa Margarita may elect to do not just the required periodic evaluation, but the amendment as well, and the amendment in part to streamline some areas related to the criteria that are in there that we think, you know, are both justified and will result in a long-term cost savings is why it's likely. This is still not to get too far down the line. We need to go through the process of doing the periodic evaluation, inform the board of what that looks like, and then the board will ultimately make the decision whether or not, yes, we think it makes sense to go and proceed with the amendment or not. However, if we're looking at setting reserves aside, the amount here would be able to cover the periodic evaluation as well as a portion of the amendment costs. The periodic evaluation is going to be conducted over a couple of years, and so the total cost of that is going to be more than the $195,000 we're seeing here. But the agency had the funds to be able to designate this reserve, not have future contributions from the member agencies spike up again next year as the work proceeds. So that's the most significant change that you're seeing here in from the February budget to the one that's proposed now. And we'll talk a little bit more about the work to be done on the periodic evaluation. I should also mention that it's not all tied necessarily to an increase in the cost. It's also a shift of the timing on it. And so some of the work that we anticipated initially being split across 26 and 27 is now a bit more front loaded to happen in 2026. And we think that's necessary to be able to be on track, both to have the periodic evaluation done as well as potential amendment. So not a change to the funding mechanisms evaluation. We still have that set aside as in reserves to be used next year. Working our way down, the agency contributions have not changed from what was proposed at the February meeting. So this collectively, the $451,790 is the same amount that the board saw with the preliminary budget. And then when we get into operating expenses, we are seeing an increase in next year in terms of overall expenses, and that directly reflects the increase in services that are tied to specifically the technical services related to the periodic evaluation. And so I'm going to jump to a summary table here that's also in the board packet and show you in more detail, because that is, you can see that 321,000 there in technical services is by far the biggest budget line related to the work on the GSP. So let me jump. The breakout table is on page 15. Yeah, so the reason I want to share this is this will give you again both what the current year revised and projected budget looks like on the various technical services, the preliminary budget amount, and then what we're proposing now. And so you can see the increase that I mentioned in the periodic evaluation. We actually have a slight cost decrease in the annual report. And that's because that process, both working with the committee charged with the annual report, and Rob's support of that, is going to continue to drive some of those costs down. M&A has also reduced some of those costs. So the other ones are, next categories are pretty similar in terms of equipment needed to maintain the monitoring network. Some of that, as we talked about in the past, is just to have on hand in case there's equipment failure, so we're able to go out and procure those. We have the data management system that's done in coordination with both the county and the neighboring mid-county groundwater agency. We have a slight decrease in the stream monitoring estimate from February to May, and in part that's because the costs have come down in the current year, and we think that there will be some potential savings next year as well. And again, that hasn't changed in terms of the funding mechanisms evaluation. So I'm gonna jump back to the overall table. Again, you can see that the difference, the general reserves, again, is tied to hitting that 15% target. So we're essentially back calculating based upon the operating expenses, making sure that we're hitting that amount. The difference between the periodic evaluation and amendment reserve is that we anticipate, right, that 163,000, 162,000 is being expended next year for work on that. And the funding mechanisms evaluation, that reserve is going away entirely because we have that 25,000 being expended in the next fiscal year. So overall, just for frame of reference, we do have the year-to-year budget changes. And specifically looking at the operating expenses, you know, some of those administrative services is dipping slightly from what the prior year approved budget had it at. But overall, we're seeing that increase because work on the periodic evaluation is really the bulk of that work is going to be done next year. So in terms of the agency contributions, I'm going to jump to that page as well. I mentioned these haven't changed from what you saw in February, but I just want to highlight those again. That's where the revenue is coming from this year. There are no active grant revenues at this point. In terms of the percentage, I know sometimes we've included that in the past, so just to give you an idea of what those translate to. We have Scotts Valley at slightly more than 46%, San Lorenzo near 32%, County of Santa Cruz at 12.5%, Mount Herman at 4.5%, and the city of Santa Cruz at 5%. So, and then the other item I want to mention is we have been in discussions with Director Pollock and Mount Herman, and sort of their continued participation in the board and their ability to make future annual contributions. And so I know that they are in the midst of looking at that and are going to keep us informed over the course of the next year, sort of where their ability to do that. I think I'll stop there. Let's see what else. In my notes here, no, I think I covered it. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to go into more detail on any of those items. And then the following item, which is the amendment to the Montgomery and Associates existing contract, also includes additional budget detail on the work that's proposed for next year. So.
Any questions from the board? Eden Cassidy.
On funding mechanisms evaluation, is one of those potential funding mechanisms Mount Herman?
The funding mechanisms evaluation is going to look at all basically the current structure that the agency is using to fund operations, as well as what are the other potential sources of funding that are out there. And so I think in the case of Mount Herman, you know, I think it's going to look at, we would have the consultant basically assess the way that the agency has funded itself to date.
Okay.
Within the range of potential options that are out there. And so. And again, this is one where the Mid-County, Santa Cruz Mid-County Groundwater Agency is in the midst of that right now.
Okay.
And so I think this agency will have the benefit of looking at sort of how that plays out. I mean, there's obviously differences between the basins, and it's not a one size fits all, but I think at the same time, having that consultant go through and assess the options is to the benefit of this agency, particularly given the overlap of some of the participating agencies.
Yeah, it says this work has not started and is anticipated to proceed.
Yeah, and so initially we thought that the work with the consultant would start this fiscal year, and we've held off on doing that in part because I think we want to go through the neighboring basin and see what happens there, and then have that.
I like to see their report.
Yeah, see what they find palatable.
Yeah. Okay, any? Doug?
So we're learning from Mid-County again, lucky us, with respect to the periodic evaluation, and I just wanted to confirm that, that the learning we're seeing here reflects our expectation that there really won't be any rules of the road changing on the format, content, or intent of those periodic evaluations between their submittal and ours. We're assuming we're gonna be running the same play, because I think that's what it said, Rob, is that the state's reluctant to consider any changes until they've gone through the process once.
Correct. The process will be the same, although it won't be as complex as it was for Mid-County Basin because of the sheer number of monitoring wells and their whole
Fair
approach,
enough.
right? So that's why the budget is more than what it took to complete a periodic evaluation in the Mid-County Basin, but they chose to not amend their plan at this time. So the budget that we're looking at includes contemplating having a plan amendment.
Okay, thank you for that.
You commented on the goal of being relieved of certain responsibilities by the state to contain costs through showing good faith effort and stability at key monitoring locations. What would you estimate, just wild guess, not to hold you to anything at all, and certainly not in this budget, recognizing that this is a few years out, but what is that? X% reduction in budget, what?
The kinds of things that we're talking about right now with the state in terms of what they call substantial compliance, right? It says we're gonna do these things, but we might have a different approach, probably 10 to 20%. So, again, we're talking about the budget for this year is under $40,000 for preparation for the annual report. I know a few years ago, it was quite a bit more than that. We've actually, even though our, per hour costs are increasing with the consultant, we've actually been driving the cost down. So we are seeing those changes now. But again, I think what behooves us is to take a good look during our periodic evaluation about the things that we said we were going to do, because we're the ones that made those commitments, right? If we want to amend our plan to seek to do a little bit less monitoring, particularly the streams are one of our largest single expenses that we have. What you have to do though is go through the periodic evaluation to build your case as to why you would eliminate those from your monitoring network. If we're successful with that, then you permanently reduce those costs. So again, that's gonna pay off, I think, even more significantly than simply this notion of substantial compliance. Hey, we're not gonna prepare these contour maps, we're gonna provide you with the spring to spring changes in a tabular format and discuss that, so.
Gotcha. And then the process for that, figuring out what to propose as changes for simplicity or cost containment, that happens over the year-long process of developing that 5-year update.
Correct. And we're gonna be nicely positioned because now we're gonna have enough data, right? We lacked the data when we prepared the groundwater sustainability plan. And we put in monitoring net wells that we haven't even talked about that are dedicated monitoring wells. And largely they are near a lot of these areas that we are monitoring stream. So if we can build the case that looking at the data in the groundwater level is an adequate surrogate for the stream monitoring, then we'll be able to build that case for limiting that from the monitoring network. That's a decision by the board, of course, going forward, but that'll be the approach.
Perfect, thank you. And then forgive me for not being more familiar with how the agency contributions were set up in the first place, but is that proportionate to water use from the basin or something like that? How did we end up with these, the 40%, 30%, approximately 5% type of apportionment of cost?
Yes.
Yeah, proportionate to water.
How much you're taking out?
Ish.
Yeah, there's some art in there.
And some generosity from us.
Yeah,
Okay,
Correct, because we don't take any groundwater.
right.
And it's changed slightly over time. So for a while there, it was entirely funded by the 3 member agencies in a slightly different split, I think 70, 20, 10, something in that neighborhood, and it's varied a little bit. And then as Director Angfer mentioned, the city agreed to make that 5% contribution. I think this started about 2 fiscal years ago, Mount Herman started to contribute. Mount Herman is, if we're looking at the small water systems, sort of in its own category in that it uses significantly more than those other systems. And so, and we appreciate their participation and representation on the board as well. So, so that's, as Sierra mentioned, there was some negotiation and some art to it, so.
Right. Well, thank you for that collaborative spirit.
Anybody else? Anything from the public? Clamoring?
Let's see. Not seeing any hands go up on
Right. And I think we need a motion to set this budget for year one.
I'll make the motion to approve the proposed budget for fiscal year 2026.
Second? Second. Okay, that definitely said, Monica.
Might be me too.
Uh,
I haven't been on this long. Yeah.
Okay, can we get a roll call, please?
Can, Director Cassidy,
Aye.
Director Engford,
Hi.
Director Koenig. I'm gonna come back, Director Larkin,
Yes.
Director Lang.
Aye.
Elisha,
Aye.
Martinez.
I,
Perry,
Aye.
Pollock,
I,
Chief,
Aye.
and Director Koenig, let me just check once more and.
Yes, sorry, my Zoom froze somehow.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
Okay, great, thank you very much, Tim. Good report. 5.2, Santa Margarita Basin Implementation Activities Status Report.
we have one before that, I think
Oh,
we've
sorry,
got the.
where'd I go? Oh, financial report.
One more, we've got 4-3 here for M&A, there you go, it's up on the slide there. I was gonna give a short
Oh, man.
report with some background on this, and so this is, as mentioned, proposal to amend an existing professional services agreement with Montgomery and Associates. As you're aware, going back a couple of years, following a competitive selection process, the board selected M&A to provide hydrologic support services. That has included a couple of tasks up to date, and I'm gonna navigate to those just so we're all looking at the same information here. They have been preparing the annual report as mentioned, and they have been doing the semi-annual twice a year groundwater level data uploads to the Sigma portal. So they're working with the member agencies, working with Rob, the data management system, gathering that data and reporting on it in June and December each year. The big change in what's proposed to you in the amended contract for the scope of work and budget for next year is the periodic evaluation. And so the first step in that is to address the corrective actions on the prior GSP. So when the agency submitted the GSP that was completed in, approved in 2021, submitted to DWR before the deadline in early 2022. DWR evaluated the plan and noted, I believe, 4 corrective actions. And so the first step in this process is M&A will go through and make recommendations on how those are addressed. Then they'll initiate preparation of the periodic evaluation, and then as discussed, if necessary, prepare that amendment. So I'm gonna scroll to a different page here, and then I'm gonna share my screen because I realized for those folks online, I would like them to be able to see this as well. And just show the tasks and also the timeline for what is proposed. So and this aligns with some of the budget discussion that we were just having as well, but essentially they have broken that out into. It's really 5 tasks, with the 6 tasks being for meetings that are gonna be conducted throughout the process. The total, and I think it's important to note again, that the work that is described here is going to cover basically the completion of the periodic evaluation and the amendment, which is gonna cut across 2 fiscal years, but the amounts that are reflected here are just for work in next fiscal year. So we've got, you know, the approximately 30,000 here, for the annual report preparation, and then the remaining bulk there for the, for both the amendment or the periodic evaluation and the amendment. And sort of a rough timeline in terms of when they would start on this. And they are, proposing to actually start with a little bit of the remaining budget in the current fiscal year, looking at the corrective actions, because they came in under budget on their, some of the current year work. They're proposing to actually start in June, looking at those corrective actions. So that's where that sort of the schedule reflects that, and the footnote reflects that there. With the end goal of having the work done, and the GSP approved by the board, no later than December of 2026, which would again put us on schedule to have the plan submitted to DWR by January of 2027. So I may stop there. There's some additional detail within the M&A proposal that breaks out the steps under task 3 under the corrective actions. And I'm happy to pull that up and get into more detail if people would like to see that in more specificity, but let me pause there and just see if there's some initial questions about the work proposed.
Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if this is a good idea or not. I'm just noticing $20,000 for meetings is a lot. It looks like there's 7 meetings presenting to the board during this part of the process. And I'm sure those are important. Are they all that important? 7 meetings is a fair bit of interaction. I don't know.
It is, I would in part,
$2,500 a meeting is just.
yeah. I think that may, and Rob, feel free to give me more details if you have more on this, but I don't know that those are necessarily limited just to the board meetings. That may include meetings with executive team. It may, if the board were to form a committee overseeing the GSP, that's potentially a role there. I know that there was quite extensive outreach on the first GSP development. And so that may be some of it as well, but I'll see if
It does list them out at task 6 meetings.
Yeah, a lot of it is actually staff meetings, so I will be directing a lot of their work to conduct this evaluation, so I think that's a big part of the assumption as well.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure that that wasn't all just to bring them here for evening meetings to speak to us. Because that would be a big financial investment for something that might be able to do more.
Yeah.
Aptly. Okay, great. But I think it's very important for you and they to have lots of collaborative conversations to manage them.
Yeah, I think it's prudent to assume the 4 board meetings. You could always scale it back, but I think it's prudent to budget for it now. In particular, again, as we dive deeper into the concept of, are we going to amend this plan or not, right? That's going to be, I think it's a significant decision to make, and you want that to be well informed. So I think it's good to plan for that. Again, if you amend a plan, it's very similar to the process that you went through for the groundwater sustainability plan. We have to file a notice of an intent to prepare a plan. So we may get some additional public involvement. We have to notify all cities and counties when we have a draft plan that could be affected by it, right? So there's a whole lot of steps. And in part, that's why we actually loaded the budget into the next fiscal year, because we started doing some backward planning and looking at some of the timing about when those notices are required and how long they have to be out to wait to hear back, et cetera. So we actually front loaded a lot of it more in the upcoming fiscal year that we really didn't think we were going to at that. But once we did that backward planning, we realized we had to.
Great, thank you.
And that's it, it's a good question. And these are in general not to exceed numbers. So, Rob is, and staff, everybody, executive team, has been really good about saving us money by doing some of, work that MMA might do and be a lot more expensive. But it's a good question. Yeah, I wouldn't want to have 7 presentations either. Anyone else?
Done. I know with favor, Georgina is back. That's a bonus for those of us who have missed her on our work. And then also was curious, since you talked a little bit about what's involved in doing an amendment. Has Montgomery done an amendment on any of their GSPs, or are we gonna be making them all year?
They assisted the Pajaro Valley, Pajaro Basin did an amendment light because they had a functional equivalent, long story, but they did actually go through an amendment process with them. So I think that they learned a little bit from that, but most of the other basins are gonna be starting theirs right now. So there's not a lot of experience by Montgomery or any others in preparing a plan amendment. We're gonna work very closely with the Department of Water Resources. I think that's one of the really good points that the department has really emphasized at a lot of public meetings. You've heard it. Once they, when we were developing our plan, they kind of wanted to have very hands-off. They wanted local agencies to develop their groundwater sustainability plans. They said, develop it, and then we will judge it. We will interact with you after we get it. Now that they've approved our plans, they're much more open to having very open conversations with us during the process. Right? So, hey, we're thinking about doing this. What do you think about that? Right? So I think we're getting a lot more feedback. So we're not overly concerned about the plan not being acceptable to the state once we get through that process.
Okay, anything else before Tim, if you proceeding? No, anything from the public just at this juncture?
Double check. Not seeing any hands go up on the public side of things.
Okay.
Yes, make a
Steve,
motion,
tell me.
we authorize.
Okay. Second. All right. Roll call vote, please.
Director Cassidy,
Aye.
Hanford,
Aye.
Kodik,
Aye.
Largay. Aye. Len.
Aye.
Leishman,
Aye.
Martinez.
Hi.
Perry,
Aye.
Pollock,
Aye.
Chief.
Aye.
Okay.
Okay. We have the financial report for the period of July 1st, 2024. Any questions on what was in the package? Do we need a presentation? All pretty self-explanatory. Nothing from the board? Anything from the public?
Let me see.
Name of our bank has changed.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not seeing any hands go up online on this
Okay.
one.
All right. Thank you. And 5.2, basin implementation activities status.
I will just say for the newer members of the board, the intent of this table is it's in every packet. It's organized around the section of the plan called GSP implementation, so we have to describe how are we gonna implement our plan. So that's why it's sort of this interesting tabular format. And those are the main sections that you'll see in the sustainability plan, and I just intended to be sort of a running update. So we put it in the packet to make sure everything gets captured, all the activities called GSP implementation. And other than, you know, you can ask questions, but other than that, it's a great read.
Okay, I'm gonna pull that up here, Rob, just in case. I think people saw it as part of the packet, but just to. For the folks online as well, so they can see what you're talking about. So.
Great.
Okay,
Okay. Any questions? Public questions? Okay, director's reports. Anyone have anything to report, Dale?
I have something that I think would fall under educational
Okay,
activities. The reason I wasn't here, the previous board meeting was that now Herman was told that they had perchlorate for wells. Perchlorate is something you do not want to have show up in one of your wells, as I learned. It causes you to shut that well down and send out a no drink order to your customers, which they were not very happy about. But I'm happy to say that the perchlorate, there is no perchlorate in our water, our groundwater over there. They came from one of our wells. After, which we suspected was kind of suspicious because, you know anything about perchlorate? It comes from manufacturing jet fuel and explosives and things of that nature. And we're thinking, there's no way, you know, that something like that would have got in the water. We thought, well, you know, would it have been possible? I don't know. And especially since our other wells were not experiencing that, they were tested clean. And Scotts Valley's and San Lorenzo's and other people that I talked to said, no, that's never showed up in any of the, you know, our wells. So we had suspicion that that was not a correct result. And so after months, well, weeks and then months of investigating and questioning and doing some additional testing and sending to other laboratories and working with the state, it was indeed an error in the testing laboratory. And a method that they had used, which they said was approved by the equipment manufacturer that they were using. And so, but eventually it came back that, oops, sorry, that was a mistake.
wow.
And eventually, the state wasn't ready to just say, well, okay, that's okay. You had to work through it with the regional, you know, state water control board. Get them to accept that, yes, this was a mistake. And then finally we did that. And so we were able to clear that, remove those results from the database. And so we're back.
So is the company going to give you those years of your life?
Yeah. So yeah, that could have significantly changed our groundwater quality degradation, you know,
Yeah,
listing and,
Yeah.
and, but so far, so yes.
that's great.
We're
Congratulations.
chlorate free.
The motto, I can see that now on the Mount Vernon. Okay, well, good news, yeah. Anyone else?
Oh, I was just gonna report that we've got one session left of the UC Davis short course. I think you're taking it as
Yes, I
well,
am.
and it's great.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying it, learning a lot.
And we're gonna get recordings of that.
Yeah.
But I was asking Tim to look in to getting access to recordings of that. I think it would make an amazing onboarding tool. Cause it really, some of it is, you know, very hydrology 101. Some of it's a little remedial for, you know, some of the board members, but some of it was very good. And the one I haven't seen yet is the GSP, you know, the last one.
Yeah,
So,
it'd be like a total of 15 hours of content.
yeah, and you know, anyway, I think it'll be good. If we ask UC Davis how we can get, you know, if you have to pay something to have access to that when we want it.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
I found it a good refresher, a
Yeah,
lot of nuance, right? Plus, exposure to some of the online systems, I found helpful personally.
Yeah.
There's some great information available up there, to kind of walk us through that.
yeah. Anybody else? And Brian, you.
Oh, sure, thanks. Many of you are aware of this. Jeff Hill on the St. Lawrence Valley Water District Board has stepped down for family health reasons, and we are recruiting a new director. And so it would be terrific if you might spread the word to folks you know who are water aware and live in the St. Lawrence Valley Water District.
Thank you, Brian.
At least I think we're recruiting, or we may recruit.
No, we are,
We are.
we're doing a board appointment, yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
It's in coastlines in the Sentinel every day.
Oh, okay,
Okay,
that's good publicity.
anyone else? I went to the Association of California Water Agencies Conference, this past few weeks ago, cleverly called Aqua. And I happen to be on the groundwater subcommittee, and I know some people who were at that meeting also here. And the state representative guy from Department of Water Resources, he talked a good game about, trying to address the cost and ease of the annual reports, and did talk about what you're saying, Rob and Sierra, about being available to, figure out a way. Can we figure out a way? So it sounded good, but, there it is. I guess 86 GSP updates have been okey dokey, only 7 found inadequate. And I don't know if there's any Monkeys fans out there, but it's not another Pleasant Valley Sunday in Pleasant Valley. They're like completely non-compliant. They're out. 7 are in probation. Chowchilla went back to the Department of Water Resources. So I don't know what they're gonna do with that, but anyway, it was a good meeting and very informative. Okay, future items. Anytime board member wants to request a future item, just get in touch with Tim and throw it out there. Informational items, event calendar. Last one, who wants to make a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Second, sure.
All those in favor, we did say aye on this one, can't we, Terry?
Yes.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming and,
Yeah.
appreciate it.